The golden afternoon light poured through the high windows of Basil Hallward's art studio, casting long streaks across the wooden floor. The air smelled of oil paint and turpentine, mingling with the faint aroma of freshly cut flowers arranged in a vase nearby. The room was warm and inviting, but an unspoken tension hung between the three men inside. At the centre of it all was Dorian Gray. He sat in a velvet chair, his golden curls catching the sunlight, his posture effortless yet elegant. He was no ordinary young man. His beauty was startling, almost unnatural in its flawlessness. His features were sharp but delicate, his lips soft, his blue eyes filled with a kind of innocent curiosity. Basil Hallward, standing before an unfinished portrait, studied his work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He had painted many fine pieces before, but nothing like this. "Oh, you don't understand, Dorian," Basil murmured, stepping back to admire his own creation. "This is the finest thing I've ever done." Dorian tilted his head slightly, amused. "You always say that, Basil." "No, this time it's true. There is something different about this one." The third man in the room, Lord Henry Wotton, smirked as he leaned against a table, observing the two of them with his usual air of amusement. Unlike Basil, who viewed Dorian with artistic reverence, Henry saw something else, an opportunity. "The finest thing you've ever done," Lord Henry drawled. "Then let's hope Dorian never changes. Otherwise your masterpiece will become a lie." Dorian laughed lightly, shaking his head. "I hardly think I will change that much, Henry." Henry walked closer, studying him with lazy curiosity. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, my dear boy. Beauty fades. Youth slips away before we even realise it. And then one day we wake up, look in the mirror, and wonder where it all went." Dorian frowned slightly. "That's a rather depressing thought." "It is simply the truth," Henry shrugged. "One day these perfect features will be gone. The smoothness of your skin will wrinkle, your hair will grey, and the world that now adores you will turn its eyes elsewhere." A strange silence filled the studio. Dorian turned toward the portrait. His painted self looked eternal, untouched by time, frozen in an unchanging state of perfection. For the first time, he truly felt the weight of Lord Henry's words. One day, this face would no longer be his. An unfamiliar panic took hold of him. "If only it were the other way around," he murmured. "If only the painting could age, and I could stay the same forever." Basil stiffened. "Dorian, don't say such things." But Lord Henry only smiled. "Be careful what you wish for, Dorian. The world is full of strange things." A chill ran through Dorian, but he shook it off with a light laugh. It was just a foolish thought, or so he believed. Lord Henry wasted no time. From the moment they left the studio, he took Dorian under his wing, introducing him to a world of pleasure and indulgence. Grand parties filled with music and laughter, whispered conversations in candlelit rooms, the thrill of admiration and desire. Dorian, once untouched by vanity, began to change. At first it was small things. He noticed the way people looked at him, the admiration in their eyes, the lingering glances of women, the envy of men. He realised he held a power that others did not, and he liked it. One evening, as they sat in a private club, Henry leaned closer. "Do you see now, Dorian? Beauty is the only thing that matters. It gives you everything." Dorian swirled his wineglass, contemplating. "And what happens when it's gone?" "Ah, my dear boy, that's precisely why you must enjoy every pleasure while you can. If virtue and restraint bring no reward, why suffer them?" Dorian was silent. Then he smiled. "Perhaps you're right." That night he gazed at his portrait, now hung proudly in his home. The painted Dorian was as untouched as ever, his expression frozen in perfect youth. He exhaled in relief. He still had time. Then Sybil Vane entered his life. She was a young actress in a small, struggling theatre. Her beauty was delicate, her voice enchanting. On stage, she did not merely act. She became her characters, pouring raw emotion into every word. Dorian was captivated. Each night he returned to watch her, spellbound by her performances. At last he arranged to meet her. Sybil was shy at first, but her eyes shone when she spoke of the stage. "Acting is my life, Dorian. It is my only truth." "And I am not?" he teased. She blushed. "Perhaps you could be." Dorian felt something new stir within him. He believed for the first time that he had found something pure, something untouched by Henry's cynicism. Days later, he made a grand announcement to Basil and Henry. "I am engaged!" Basil was delighted. Lord Henry smirked. "Engaged? To whom?" "Sybil Vane." Henry leaned back, sipping his drink. "Ah, and do you love her?" "She is art itself, Henry. She is perfect. You will see." Dorian invited them to the theatre. That night he waited eagerly for the performance to begin. But when Sybil took the stage, something was wrong. She was terrible. Her voice was flat, her movements stiff. Every line she spoke sounded hollow. Dorian sat frozen. When the play ended, he rushed backstage. "What happened?" Sybil smiled. "Dorian, I have found something greater than acting. I no longer need to pretend." Dorian's stomach twisted. "So, you cannot act anymore?" "Why would I need to when my love is real?" Dorian stepped back. "Then you are nothing." Her face paled. "Dorian, I do not love you anymore." And he left. That night he returned home and passed by his portrait. Something was different. The mouth had changed. A faint curl of cruelty now twisted the painted lips. Dorian's heart stopped. The next morning a letter arrived. Sybil had killed herself. Dorian dropped the note, his hands trembling. For a brief moment, a deep dread filled his soul. But then a whisper in his mind, Lord Henry's voice, reminded him, "Do not waste time mourning. Life is too short." And just like that, the fear faded. Instead, he turned toward his portrait. And for the first time, he smiled. In the days that followed Sybil Vane's death, Dorian expected grief to consume him. But it never came. At first, he told himself he was simply in shock, that the sorrow would arrive later. But as time passed, something strange happened. He felt nothing. He remembered how she had looked at him, how her voice had trembled with love and devotion. He had felt powerful that night, walking away from her, leaving her broken. Now she was dead. Shouldn't he feel something? He turned to Lord Henry for guidance. "There is no reason to burden yourself with guilt, Dorian," Henry said smoothly, as they sat in his richly furnished study. "Death is merely the final act of a grand performance. She played her part. Now you must move on." Dorian exhaled. "You make it sound so trivial." "That's because it is, my dear boy. Tragedies happen. It is how we choose to view them that matters." Dorian hesitated. "I keep thinking about the portrait, Henry. I swear it has changed." Henry smirked. "The only thing that has changed is your outlook on life." Dorian wanted to believe him. But later that night, when he stood before the portrait in his private study, he couldn't deny what he saw. The painted Dorian still held the beauty of youth, but there was something in the eyes now, something dark. And the lips, once soft and full, had curled into an unmistakable mocking sneer. It was as though the painting was watching him, judging him, or worse, becoming him. A flicker of panic crept into his chest, but then a thought struck him. If the painting bore the marks of his sins, did that mean he would remain untouched? A slow, thrilling realization settled over him. The portrait was his shield, and that meant he was free. Once Dorian accepted his immunity, he began to change. At first the shift was subtle. He spoke more boldly, indulged in pleasures without hesitation, embraced Lord Henry's philosophy more fully. But soon whispers followed him. "There's something unnatural about him," people murmured. "He never seems to age." At first it was admiration, then suspicion. Years passed. While his peers withered, their faces lined with time, Dorian remained perfect. But behind locked doors, the portrait told a different story. The hands, once graceful, had grown almost claw-like in their thinness. The once bright eyes now burned with malice. Every sin, every indulgence, Every selfish act left its mark on the canvas. And Dorian no longer cared. He hid the painting away, locking it in the attic, covering it with a heavy drape. Out of sight, out of mind. And still he lived without restraint. Friendships crumbled in his wake. Reputations were destroyed by his whispers. Hearts were shattered by his carelessness. And yet no one could turn away from him, because he was still Dorian Gray, still young, still beautiful. Then, one stormy October night, Basil Hallward returned. Dorian had not seen his old friend in some time. Basil had heard the whispers of how Dorian had become someone else, and he was disturbed. "Dorian, I must speak with you," Basil said as he entered the grand estate. His face was lined with concern. Dorian leaned lazily against the fireplace, swirling a glass of wine. "Basil, how wonderful to see you." Basil didn't smile. "There are terrible rumours about you, Dorian. They say you have ruined men's lives, destroyed reputations, that you have become something unnatural." Dorian smirked. "People love to gossip. But they also say," Basil continued, stepping closer, "that you have not changed, not even a day." Dorian set his glass down. "Perhaps I have simply been lucky." Basil shook his head. "Number, I don't believe in luck like that." There was a long silence, and then Basil whispered, "Show me the portrait." Dorian stiffened. The air in the room grew heavier. No one had seen the painting in years, but something inside Dorian, something wicked, wanted to show him, wanted him to see. A slow smile spread across his lips. "Very well, Basil." He led him down the darkened halls, up the winding staircase, to the locked attic door. Dorian retrieved a key from his pocket. It clicked in the lock. The door creaked open. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and secrets. Basil stepped in first. Dorian followed behind, his heart thrumming. And then, with one swift motion, he pulled away the drape. Basil gasped, and then he screamed. Basil staggered back, his face pale, his breath shallow. He could not believe what he was seeing. The portrait was monstrous. Dorian's once youthful beauty had decayed into something horrific, his face now lined with cruelty, his eyes sunken and filled with pure malice. The hands, once delicate, were twisted into something almost clawed. The mouth sneered, filled with corruption and sin. Basil trembled. "My God, what is this?" Dorian tilted his head, amused. "You should recognise it, Basil. You painted it." Basil turned to him, eyes wide with horror. This is your soul." Dorian's expression darkened. "Do you know how tiring it is to hear that?" Basil grabbed his arm. "Dorian, you must change. It's not too late. This thing can still be redeemed." Dorian laughed coldly. "Redeemed?" "Basil, you don't understand. I don't want redemption." Basil's grip tightened. "I won't let you keep living like this. I will tell the world what you've become." Dorian's eyes flashed. His heart pounded. A dark, thrilling rage overtook him. And before he could think, he grabbed a knife from the desk. Basil's eyes widened. "Dorian!" The blade plunged into his chest. Basil gasped, stumbling back. Dorian stabbed him again, and again. The room was silent except for the sound of his own breathing. Basil's lifeless body slumped to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Dorian stared down at him, and felt nothing. He turned toward the portrait. The painted hands were now stained with blood. Dorian exhaled. "It's done." But he knew this was only the beginning. Dorian stood in the dimly lit attic, staring at Basil's lifeless body. The metallic scent of blood clung to the air, thick and suffocating. His hands were still trembling, but not from fear. From exhilaration. He had killed a man. And yet, as he turned toward the portrait, he remained untouched. His reflection in the tall mirror was as perfect as ever. The painting, however, had changed again. The twisted, monstrous face of Dorian Gray now had fresh streaks of red smeared across its hands. The hands that had killed Basil. A flicker of something stirred inside him. Was it guilt? Regret? Number. It was relief. Basil had seen too much. He had left Dorian with no choice. Now there was only one thing left to do. He had to get rid of the body. Dorian paced his study, glass in hand, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. He needed help. But who? And then it came to him. Alan Campbell. Alan was a chemist, a man of intelligence and science. More importantly, he had once been a friend, before Dorian's influence had driven a wedge between them. Dorian wrote a note. Alan, I must see you at once. Do not refuse me. It is a matter of life and death. D.G. He sent a servant to deliver it. An hour later, Alan arrived. The man looked tired, aged by some invisible burden, and when he stepped into Dorian's study, his expression was cold. Why have you summoned me? Dorian offered him a forced smile. I need a favour. Alan stiffened. If this is some new scandal, I want no part of it. Dorian poured himself another drink, his hands finally steady. There's no need for dramatics. It's a simple request. I need you to dispose of a body. Alan froze. A body? Dorian leaned forward. In the attic, upstairs. It must disappear. Completely. Alan's face turned pale. My God, Dorian, what have you done? Dorian sighed as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience. You were always such a brilliant chemist, Alan. You know how to make things vanish. Alan stood up abruptly, rage flashing in his eyes. I will do no such thing. Dorian smiled. Oh, I think you will. He walked to his desk, retrieved a sealed envelope and tossed it onto the table. Alan hesitated. What is this? A letter, addressed to the police. Inside, a very detailed account of an unfortunate incident from your past, one that would ruin you completely. Alan's hands curled into fists. You would blackmail me? Dorian sipped his wine. If I must. Alan shook with anger, but he knew there was no escape. An hour later, Basil Hallward no longer existed. With Basil gone, Dorian should have felt safe. But he didn't. Something was different now. Before, his sins had been pleasures. Indulgences he could dismiss with a smile. But murder left a stain even he could feel. He threw himself into distraction. He drank more. He chased every pleasure London had to offer. He disappeared into opium dens, seeking oblivion among the desperate and the forgotten. One night, in a dimly lit room filled with swirling smoke, a man grabbed his wrist. You are Dorian Gray, the man hissed. Dorian's blood ran cold. He turned, meeting the wild, furious eyes of a man he had never seen before. But he knew who he was. James Vane, Sybil's brother. You destroyed my sister, James whispered. And now, I will destroy you. Dorian forced a smile, but his hands clenched at his sides. My dear man, there must be some mistake. I am far too young to be the Dorian Gray you seek. James hesitated. Dorian gestured toward a cracked mirror on the wall. Look at me. Sybil died. How many years ago? And yet, do I look any older than 20? James frowned, uncertainty flickering across his face. Dorian saw his chance. He laughed, shaking his head. You are mistaken, my friend. And then he walked away. But James's eyes followed him. And Dorian knew this was not over. For days, Dorian was on edge. James Vane was out there, watching, waiting. Dorian tried to pretend he was untouchable, but paranoia crept into his mind. Then fate intervened. One afternoon, while on a hunting trip with friends, a shot rang out. A servant had mistaken a man for a deer, a tragic accident. When they retrieved the body, Dorian froze. It was James Vane. Dorian exhaled, relief washing over him. I am safe again. But when he returned home and looked at the portrait, he felt his stomach turn. The eyes... The painted eyes were laughing at him, and for the first time Dorian felt fear. Dorian tried to reform. He swore off his sins. I will be good again, he whispered. But when he checked the portrait, the face was unchanged. It was still monstrous, still rotting, still damned. His attempts at virtue were meaningless. His soul was already lost. A deep, desperate rage consumed him. He grabbed the knife. "I will destroy you." The blade plunged into the painting. A terrible scream filled the house. The servants rushed in, and they found a withered corpse on the floor. Old, hideous, decayed beyond recognition. The face was twisted in eternal horror. But on the wall, the portrait of Dorian Gray hung, untouched. The young man in the painting was as beautiful as ever. But Dorian Gray was dead. If you enjoyed it, subscribe so you don't miss more incredible books. Stay tuned. Many more fascinating stories are coming soon.